At 73 years old, I not only outsmarted a team of professional scammers who tried to steal my life savings, but I helped the FBI take down an entire criminal network that was targeting elderly people across the country. But how I got from victim to crime-fighting grandmother? Well, that's a story that'll make you think twice before you trust that next phone call. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. My name is Helen Carpenter, and I'm a 73-year-old retired high school English teacher from Columbus, Ohio. For 48 years, I taught teenagers how to think critically, analyze information, and spot when someone was trying to pull the wool over their eyes. You'd think those skills would have made me immune to scammers, but you'd be wrong. It all started 6 months after my husband Frank had passed away from cancer. I was still adjusting to living alone in our 3-bedroom house, still learning how to manage finances that Frank had always handled, and frankly, still feeling pretty lonely most days. That's when the phone calls began. The first call came on a Tuesday morning while I was having my coffee and reading the newspaper, something I still did the old-fashioned way, despite my granddaughter Emma's attempts to get me onto the internet. "Grandma Helen? Grandma, is that you?" The voice was young, male, and sounded panicked and upset. Now, I have 3 grandsons, Emma's boys, ages 22, 19, and 16. The voice sounded like it could be Tyler, my middle grandson who was away at college in Michigan. "Tyler? Is that you, sweetheart? You sound terrible. Are you okay?" "Grandma, I'm in so much trouble. I can't call Mom and Dad because they'll kill me. I was at this party last night and there was drinking, and I made a terrible mistake. I was driving back to the dorm and I hit someone's car. The police came and they arrested me for DUI. My heart immediately started racing. Tyler had always been a good kid, but college changes young people sometimes. The voice was crying now, sounding absolutely desperate. "Oh my goodness, Tyler. Are you hurt? Where are you calling from?" "I'm at the police station, Grandma. They're letting me make one phone call before they process me. The lawyer here says I need $8,000 for bail money, or I'll have to stay in jail until my court date next month. Grandma, I can't call Mom and Dad. Dad will disown me if he finds out I got a DUI. Please, you're the only one who can help me." I was already reaching for my purse, my grandmother instincts in full overdrive. This poor child was in trouble, scared, and needed help. "Of course I'll help you, sweetheart. How do I get you the money?" "The lawyer says it has to be cash and it has to be today. There's a Western Union location near you. Can you go there and send it to the bail bondsman here in Michigan? I'll give you the name and address." Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I missed. The call came from an unknown number, not Tyler's cell phone. The voice was similar to Tyler's, but not exactly right. The story was designed to hit every emotional button a grandmother has: a grandchild in trouble, fear of disappointing parents, urgency, and the need for secrecy. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting my grandson out of jail. I drove straight to the Western Union location at our local grocery store. The clerk, a young woman named Jessica, helped me send $8,000 to someone named Michael Johnson at an address in Detroit. I remember thinking it was odd that the bail bondsman had such a common name, but I was focused on helping Tyler. "Ma'am, I have to ask, do you know the person you're sending this money to?" "It's for my grandson's bail money. He's in trouble and needs help." Jessica looked concerned. "Did your grandson call you directly from jail? Because usually when people call from jail, it shows up as a collect fall from the correctional facility." I paused, suddenly feeling uneasy. "I thought he said he was calling from the police station." "Mrs. Carpenter, I don't want to alarm you, but we see a lot of scams that target grandparents. They pretend to be grandchildren in trouble and ask for bail money. Are you absolutely sure this was your grandson?" My confidence started to waver. The voice sounded like him, but maybe a little different. He said he was crying because he was upset. Jessica's expression grew more serious. "Ma'am, before you send this money, could you try calling your grandson directly, or maybe call your daughter to confirm he's actually in trouble?" Part of me wanted to listen to Jessica's advice, but the voice on the phone had been so convincing, so desperate. What if Tyler really was in jail and I was wasting time with unnecessary verification? What if delaying him cost him another night in jail? "I need to help him," I said, completing the Western Union form. I sent the $8,000 and drove home feeling anxious but proud that I'd been able to help my grandson in his time of need. 2 hours later, my daughter Julie called me. "Mom, Tyler just called me from his dorm room. He wanted to know if you were okay because you left him 3 voicemails asking about jail and bail money. What's going on?" My blood turned to ice. If Tyler was in his dorm room, who had I just sent $8,000 to? I explained the morning's events to Julie, and she immediately came over with Tyler on FaceTime. Seeing his healthy, happy face and hearing his normal voice, I realized how different the caller actually sounded. "Mom," Julie said gently, "you've been scammed. This is something called the grandparent scam. They research families online, learn the names of grandchildren, and then call grandparents pretending to be in trouble." I felt stupid, embarrassed, and angry all at the same time. How could someone prey on a grandmother's love for her grandchildren? How could I, a retired teacher who had spent decades teaching critical thinking, fall for such an obvious scam? But as I sat there that evening, replaying the phone call in my mind, I realized something important. I wasn't stupid. I had been targeted by professionals who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. They had researched my family, practiced their script, and executed a carefully planned psychological manipulation. And that made me mad, really mad. I called the police to report the scam, but Officer Martinez, who took my report, wasn't very encouraging. "Mrs. Carpenter, I'm sorry this happened to you, but these scammers operate from all over the country, sometimes internationally. The chances of recovering your money or catching the people responsible are pretty slim. The best we can do is file a report and add it to the database." "So they just get away with it?" I asked. "Unfortunately, most of the time, yes. These scams are incredibly common, and law enforcement resources are limited. The best defense is prevention, educating people about how these scams work." As I hung up the phone, I made a decision that would change my life forever. If law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't go after these scammers with the resources they deserved, maybe it was time for someone else to get involved. Maybe it was time for a retired English teacher to show these criminals what happens when they mess with the wrong grandmother. That's when I decided they had messed with the wrong grandmother. After losing $8,000 to the fake grandson scam, I thought my troubles with phone scammers were over. I was wrong. Apparently, once your name gets on certain lists as someone who fell for a scam, it gets shared among criminal networks. My phone number had just been marked as a hot lead, someone who could be successfully manipulated into sending money. The calls started coming more frequently, and they were getting more sophisticated. 3 weeks after the fake Tyler incident, I received another call that nearly fooled me again. This time, the caller claimed to be from the Internal Revenue Service. "Mrs. Helen Carpenter, this is Agent Rodriguez from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We have a very serious situation. Our records show that you owe $12,847 in back taxes from 2019, and there's been a warrant issued for your arrest." My heart started pounding. Frank had always handled our taxes, and since his death, I'd been worried about whether I was doing everything correctly. "I don't understand. I filed my taxes with our accountant." "Mrs. Carpenter, there was an error in your filing that constitutes tax fraud. However, because you're a senior citizen and this appears unintentional, we can resolve this today without involving local law enforcement." The caller explained I needed to pay the back taxes immediately to avoid arrest. The payment had to be made through iTunes gift cards because it was a secure government payment method that couldn't be traced by identity thieves. Even as he talked, part of my teacher brain was screaming that this didn't make sense. The IRS doesn't call people directly. They send letters. And they definitely don't accept iTunes gift cards as payment. But the other part of my brain, still grieving Frank, still worried about managing everything alone, still shaken by the previous scam, was terrified. "I need to call my accountant and verify this. Mrs. Carpenter, if you hang up this phone, the warrant becomes active immediately, and local police will be dispatched to your address for arrest. I'm trying to help you resolve this quietly." The caller put me on hold while he checked with his supervisor. I used those minutes to think clearly. I remembered reading about IRS scams in the newspaper. I remember Julie warning me after the grandson scam to be suspicious of urgent phone calls asking for money. When Agent Rodriguez returned, I was ready. "Sir, I've decided I want to handle this through proper channels. If there's really a warrant, then police can arrest me, and I'll sort it out with a lawyer and the real IRS." There was a long pause. Then the caller's tone changed completely. "Lady, you're making a big mistake. We know where you live. We know you're alone. Pay the money or you'll be sorry." The mask had slipped. Agent Rodriguez had revealed himself to be a criminal making threats against a 73-year-old woman. I hung up and immediately called the real police. This time, I got Detective Sarah Walsh from the Financial Crimes Unit, and she was much more interested than the previous officer. Mrs. Carpenter, you did exactly the right thing. This is called an IRS impersonation scam, and it's extremely common targeting seniors. The fact that you received this so soon after the grandson scam suggests you're being specifically targeted. What do you mean? These scammer networks share information. Once they identify someone as vulnerable, a recent widow, someone who fell for a previous scam, they put your information on lists that get sold to other scammers. You're probably going to get more calls. Detective Walsh was right. Over the next month, I received at least a dozen more scam calls. Medicare fraud, claiming my card was compromised. Tech support, saying my computer had viruses. Bank fraud, claiming someone accessed my account. Charity calls for local police officers. Each call was designed to create fear, urgency, and confusion. But something interesting was happening. Instead of becoming more afraid, I was getting curious. My teacher instincts were kicking in. I started taking notes during each call. What techniques did they use to build credibility? How did they create urgency? What emotional triggers were they pulling? My notebook filled up quickly. They always knew my full name and address. They claimed to represent legitimate organizations. They created artificial time pressure. They used fear of legal consequences. They insisted on secrecy. They demanded untraceable payments. When challenged, they became threatening. After a particularly aggressive call from someone claiming to be from Windows technical support, I called Detective Walsh again. Detective, I'm still getting multiple scam calls every week. Isn't there anything we can do? Mrs. Carpenter, these operations are usually overseas or difficult to track, unless we can catch them in the act with specific evidence. She trailed off, but I could hear something in her voice. Detective Walsh, is there something you're not telling me? Mrs. Carpenter, in your teaching career, did you ever deal with students trying to cheat or manipulate you? All the time. Why? How did you handle those situations? I learned their methods. I stayed ahead of way. I set traps to catch them. Exactly. What would you say if I told you there might be a way to use your situation to help us catch these scammers? What kind of way? It would involve some risk and require you to be very brave. But if you're willing to work with us, we might be able to turn the tables on these people. I looked around my empty house, thought about Frank's death, the $8,000 I'd lost, and all the other elderly people getting these same calls. Detective Walsh, I spent 48 years dealing with teenagers who thought they were smarter than me. I think I can handle a few phone scammers. In that case, how would you feel about going undercover? But little did those scammers know, their biggest mistake was targeting a retired teacher who was about to give them the education of their lives. That's when I decided they had messed with the wrong grandmother. After Detective Walsh suggested I might be able to help catch the scammers, I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility. Here I was, a 73-year-old widow who had already lost money to these criminals, and suddenly I was being offered a chance to fight back. But I needed to understand exactly what I was getting into. I called my neighbor, Carol Peterson, who had been my closest friend since she and her late husband moved in next door 15 years ago. Carol was 69, sharp as a tack, and had a background in banking that made her naturally suspicious of financial schemes. Carol, I said over coffee in my kitchen, I need to tell you about something that's been happening, and I need your advice. I explained the whole situation, the grandson scam, the IRS scam, the ongoing phone calls, and Detective Walsh's suggestion that I work with the police. Carol listened without interrupting, but I could see her banker's analytical mind working. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Helen, how much do you actually know about these scam operations? I mean, beyond what you've experienced personally. Not much, I suppose, just what Detective Walsh has told me. Before you decide whether to work with the police, I think we need to do some research. If you're going to fight these people, you need to understand exactly what you're up against. That afternoon, Carol introduced me to something I'd never really used before: internet research. She came over with her laptop and showed me how to search for information about phone scams targeting seniors. What we discovered was both horrifying and enlightening. According to the FBI, phone scams targeting elderly Americans steal over $3 billion every year. The average victim loses around $10,000, but some lose their entire life savings. The scammers work in organized groups, often operating from overseas locations that make prosecution difficult.
But most shocking was learning about the scope of the targeting. These weren't random phone calls. The scammers purchased lists of elderly Americans from data brokers, complete with information about recent deaths in the family, financial status, health conditions, and family relationships. They knew Frank had died. They knew I lived alone. They knew I had money to steal. "Helen, look at this," Carol said, pointing to an article on her laptop screen. "This says the scammers specifically target recent widows because we're considered high-value, low-risk victims. High value because we often have access to life insurance payouts and retirement accounts. Low risk because we're less likely to report being scammed due to embarrassment." I felt a chill reading those words. I wasn't just a random victim. I had been deliberately selected, studied, and targeted because criminals viewed me as an easy mark. We spent the next several hours researching different types of scams. The variety was staggering. Romance scams, lottery scams, charity scams, home repair scams, and dozens of others, each one designed to exploit different vulnerabilities. But as we researched, I started noticing patterns in how the scams worked. They all used similar psychological techniques: building false trust, creating artificial urgency, exploiting emotional triggers like fear or greed, and isolating victims from people who might provide perspective. "You know what's interesting, Carol?" I said as we were wrapping up our research session. "These scammers are using exactly the same manipulation techniques I used to see from cheating students. They create false credibility, they try to bypass critical thinking with emotional pressure, and they count on their victims being too embarrassed to seek help." Carol looked at me with interest. "What do you mean?" I understood how to catch students who were cheating by understanding their methods. Students who were copying homework had certain patterns. Students who were plagiarizing essays had certain tells. Once I understood their techniques, I could catch them every time. "So you think you could apply those same skills to dealing with scammers?" "I think I already have been. The reason I didn't fall for the IRS scam was because I recognized the manipulation techniques. My teacher instincts kicked in." That evening, I called Detective Walsh and asked if we could meet in person to discuss her suggestion about working with the police. The next morning, Detective Walsh came to my house, and she brought someone with her, FBI agent Tom Bradley from the Financial Crimes Task Force. "Mrs. Carpenter," Agent Bradley said, "Detective Walsh has told me about your situation, and frankly, we're very interested in working with you. What you've experienced, being targeted by multiple scam operations in succession, suggests you're dealing with a sophisticated network that we've been trying to track down for months. What exactly would working with you involve?" Detective Walsh leaned forward. "Here's what we know. These scammer networks operate like businesses. They have call centers, scripts, training programs, and management structures. They're constantly looking for new victims, but they also try to squeeze maximum money out of victims who have already fallen for one scam. Which is why you keep getting more calls," Agent Bradley added. "Your number is on their hot list as someone who can be successfully targeted. What we'd like to do," Detective Walsh continued, "is use that to our advantage. Instead of trying to avoid the scammers, we want you to engage them while we monitor and record everything." Agent Bradley pulled out a small device that looked like a regular phone. "This is a specially modified phone that records all calls and allows us to trace the calls back to their source. We'd also equip you with recording equipment for in-person meetings if any of the scammers want to meet face-to-face. The goal," Detective Walsh explained, "would be to gather evidence that we can use to identify, locate, and prosecute the people running these operations. But I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Carpenter, there would be some risk involved." "What kind of risk?" "These are criminals. They can become aggressive or threatening when they realize they're being investigated. There's also the risk that you might accidentally say or do something that tips them off to our operation." I thought about Frank, who had always worried about me taking on too much, who had tried to protect me from anything dangerous or difficult. I thought about the $8,000 I'd lost and how stupid it made me feel. I thought about all the other elderly people getting these same calls, feeling the same fear and confusion that I had felt. "Agent Bradley, Detective Walsh, I have one question. If I do this, if I help you catch these people, will it actually stop them from victimizing other people like me?" "Mrs. Carpenter," Agent Bradley said, "if we can take down this network, we estimate it could prevent hundreds or thousands of other seniors from being victimized. These aren't small-time criminals. This is organized crime that's specifically targeting elderly Americans." I looked around my living room, at the pictures of Frank and our family, at the comfortable home we'd built together over decades of marriage. Frank was gone, but I was still here, and I was tired of feeling like a victim. When do we start? Detective Walsh smiled. Mrs. Carpenter, I have a feeling these scammers have no idea what they're in for. Over the next week, Agent Bradley and Detective Walsh trained me in what they called controlled engagement with scammers. I learned how to keep them on the line without seeming suspicious. I learned how to ask questions that would help investigators track down their locations. I learned how to appear vulnerable and naive while actually gathering intelligence. Most importantly, I learned that I wasn't going to be a passive victim anymore. I was going to be an active participant in taking down the criminals who had targeted me and thousands of people like me. The next time my specially equipped phone rang with a scammer's call, I was ready for them. But what happened next made them realize their biggest mistake was targeting a grandmother who had just become their worst nightmare.
2 weeks into my training with Detective Walsh and Agent Bradley, I received the call that would change everything. It came on a Thursday morning, and thanks to the FBI's recording equipment, every word was captured. Mrs. Carpenter, this is Michael Johnson from Financial Recovery Services. I'm calling with very good news about the money you lost to those telephone scammers. I almost laughed out loud. After weeks of research and training, I immediately recognized this as a recovery scam. Criminals who target previous scam victims by claiming they can recover stolen money. But instead of hanging up, I played the role Detective Walsh had trained me for, a confused, hopeful elderly woman who desperately wanted her money back. Oh my goodness, really? Someone told me there was no way to get that money back. Mrs. Carpenter, that's what the criminals want you to think. But we work with law enforcement to track down stolen funds and return them to victims. However, there are time-sensitive legal requirements we need to handle immediately. Following my training, I asked seemingly innocent questions designed to gather intelligence. What agency do you work with? How did you find my money? Each question was answered with lies, designed to create urgency and prevent clear thinking. But while Michael thought he was manipulating a confused elderly woman, I was building a case against him. I can prove this is legitimate, he said. I'm putting you in touch with Agent Rodriguez from the Federal Trade Commission, who is working on your case. When Agent Rodriguez came on the line, I recognized his voice. He was the same person who had called weeks earlier, claiming to be from the IRS, trying to scare me into paying fake back taxes. For 20 minutes, I listened to an elaborate performance designed to convince me that these criminals were actually law enforcement officers. They had clearly done this many times before. Mr. Johnson, this sounds wonderful, but I need time to think about this and maybe talk to my family. Mrs. Carpenter, I understand your caution, but we can only hold these funds for 24 hours. If you don't act today, the money will be permanently forfeited. Classic scammer technique. Artificial time pressure to prevent victims from seeking advice. Well, I suppose I could go get the processing fee money today. Excellent. For security reasons, the fee needs to be paid in Amazon gift cards. I told Michael I would buy the gift cards and call him back within hours. Agent Bradley called immediately after I hung up. Mrs. Carpenter, that was perfect. Now comes the interesting part. We want you to call him back with fake gift card codes that we've prepared. When they don't work, he'll get frustrated and potentially reveal more about his operation. That afternoon, I called Michael back. Mr. Johnson, this is Helen Carpenter. I have the gift cards you asked for. Wonderful. Go ahead and read me the redemption codes. I read him the fake codes Agent Bradley had given me. After trying to redeem them, Mrs. Carpenter, these codes aren't working. Are you sure you read them correctly? I reread the same fake codes. These codes are definitely not working. Let me transfer you to my supervisor. I could hear panicked voices in the background, multiple people discussing the problem. Agent Bradley had explained this behind-the-scenes audio could provide valuable intelligence about the operation's size and structure. A new voice came on claiming to be David Miller, the supervisor. What we're going to do is have you send us photos of the cards before you read the codes, just to make sure there are no technical issues.
Now they wanted pictures sent to an email address, giving us another way to track them. Over the next 2 hours, I continued the charade while the FBI gathered more intelligence about the scammer network. But the breakthrough came when David Miller got frustrated enough to suggest something different. Mrs. Carpenter, these gift card systems seem to have been problems today. What I'd like to do is have one of our local representatives meet you in person to collect the processing fee in cash. My heart started racing. They wanted to meet in person. Agent Bradley had told me this was the best case scenario for building a strong legal case. That would be much easier for me. I said, "When can someone come by? How about tomorrow afternoon? Our representative will come to your house around 2 p.m. After I hung up, I immediately called Agent Bradley. They want to meet in person tomorrow. Mrs. Carpenter, this is exactly what we were hoping for. Tomorrow, we're going to catch these criminals in the act. But what happened at that meeting would prove that these scammers had severely underestimated what they were dealing with when they decided to target this particular grandmother."
The morning of the meetup, my house looked like something out of a crime drama. Agent Bradley arrived at dawn with a technical team that spent 2 hours installing hidden cameras and microphones throughout my living room. They positioned FBI agents in unmarked vehicles around the neighborhood and briefed me one final time. "Remember, Mrs. Carpenter," Agent Bradley said, "keep them talking and keep them here long enough for us to gather evidence. If anything feels dangerous, just say, 'I need to call my daughter,' and we'll move in immediately." Detective Walsh positioned herself in my basement with monitoring equipment. Carol Peterson would call during the meeting to provide a distraction if needed. At exactly 2 p.m., a black sedan pulled into my driveway. 2 men got out, one well-dressed in a business suit carrying a briefcase, the other younger, staying by the car. "Mrs. Carpenter, I'm David Miller from Financial Recovery Services." The man was professional-looking and spoke with confidence, but I immediately noticed the same slight accent I had heard from other phone scammers. "Oh, Mr. Miller, please come in. Can I offer you some coffee?" "We should handle our business first. I know you're eager to get your stolen money back." He opened his briefcase, pulling out what looked like official documents. Having researched scammer techniques, I could see the papers were fake. Generic forms with impressive seals designed to fool someone who wouldn't examine them closely. "Now, Mrs. Carpenter, I need to collect the $2,500 processing fee, and then I can transfer your recovered $8,000 into your bank account." I had prepared an envelope with fake money. Real bills on the outside, paper cut to size on the inside. "Mr. Miller, I called the FTC this morning, and they said they don't work with private recovery companies. Can you explain that?" I watched his expression carefully. Agent Bradley had told me that challenging scammers often made them reveal more about their operations. "We don't work directly with the FTC. We work with local law enforcement agencies. We work with the Ohio State Financial Crimes Division." There is no Ohio State Financial Crimes Division. Agent Bradley had prepared me to recognize fake authority references. "Could you show me identification proving you work for this agency?" Now, irritation showed through his professional facade. "Mrs. Carpenter, we don't have time for these questions. If you want to recover your stolen money, we need to complete this transaction today." I handed him the envelope with fake money, and he quickly counted it without examining the bills closely. "Perfect. Now I need your bank account information so I can deposit your recovered funds." This was the moment Agent Bradley had prepared me for. David Miller was about to commit bank fraud in addition to extortion. "Let me get my checkbook so I can give you the account numbers." "Right on schedule," Carol called. "Hello?" I answered. "Helen, there's a police car in your driveway. Is everything okay?" David Miller immediately tensed up. "Mrs. Carpenter, who is that?" "Just my neighbor. She saw a police car. Probably an accident in the neighborhood." But David Miller was already standing, looking nervous. "I think we should reschedule this meeting." "Oh, but you have my money, and I gave you the processing fee." At that moment, my front door opened and Agent Bradley walked in, followed by 2 other FBI agents. "FBI, nobody move." The look of pure terror on David Miller's face was unforgettable. The confident scammer instantly transformed into a panicked criminal caught in the act. He tried to run toward my back door, but agents were waiting there too. Within 30 seconds, he was handcuffed and being read his rights. "Ma'am," Agent Bradley said loudly for the recording, "can you tell me what this man was doing here?"
He said he was from financial recovery services and was going to help me get back money I lost to phone scammers. He took $2,500 from me and was asking for my bank account information. As Agent Bradley continued the questioning for the official record, I noticed David Miller, whose real name was Carlos Hernandez, staring at me with growing realization. You set me up, he said. I looked directly at him. Carlos, I'm 73 years old, and I taught high school English for 48 years. Did you really think you were the first person to try to lie to me and steal my money? Carlos's phone contained contact information for dozens of other scammers. His briefcase contained fake documents, victim lists, and records of other elderly targets. Most importantly, Carlos wasn't just a street-level scammer. He was a coordinator who worked directly with the call centers that had been targeting me and hundreds of other seniors. That evening, Detective Walsh debriefed me. Mrs. Carpenter, what we accomplished today was extraordinary. Carlos is already cooperating because he's facing serious federal charges. He's giving us information about the entire network. How many people can we help? Based on Carlos's information, we're looking at a network targeting thousands of elderly Americans. This one arrest could lead to dozens more. But Agent Bradley had one more surprise. Mrs. Carpenter, we'd like to consider expanding your role. We want you to become the face of fighting back against elder fraud. But what happened next made them realize their biggest mistake was targeting a grandmother who had just discovered she was very good at this crime-fighting business.
2 weeks after Carlos Hernandez's arrest, Agent Bradley called me with news that would change everything. Mrs. Carpenter, Carlos has been extremely cooperative, and what he's told us is bigger than we ever imagined. We're not just dealing with a local scammer network. This is part of an international criminal organization with operations in 6 states and connections to call centers in India and Jamaica. Carlos had revealed that the scammers targeting me were part of what law enforcement calls a boiler room operation. Dozens of people working in shifts to call elderly Americans from morning until night, using sophisticated scripts and psychological manipulation techniques developed by criminal psychologists. The good news, Agent Bradley continued, is that Carlos has given us enough information to coordinate simultaneous raids on 3 major call centers. But we need your help for the final phase of the operation. What kind of help? We want you to make one more call to the main number that's been used to target you. But this time, instead of pretending to be a victim, we want you to deliver a message that will make them panic and potentially lead us to the top of their organization. The plan was brilliant and terrifying at the same time. I would call the scammer number and tell them that I was cooperating with the FBI, that Carlos had been arrested 2 weeks ago, and that I knew about their entire operation. The goal was to create enough panic among the criminals that they would start making mistakes, calling their supervisors, trying to warn other parts of the network, or attempting to flee. All of these communications would be monitored and traced by the FBI. Mrs. Carpenter, I have to warn you, once you make this call, you'll no longer be undercover. These people will know you've been working with law enforcement, and that could potentially put you at risk. I thought about Frank, who had always worried about me taking risks. But I also thought about all the elderly people who were getting scammed every day, while I have the power to help stop it. Agent Bradley, let's make the call. The next morning, surrounded by FBI agents and recording equipment, I dialed the number that had been used to target me dozens of times over the past few months. Financial Recovery Services, this is Michael Johnson. How can I help you today? I recognized the voice immediately. It was one of the original scammers who had tried to steal $2,500 from me with the fake recovery scam. Michael, this is Helen Carpenter. We've spoken before. Mrs. Carpenter, have you reconsidered our offer to recover your stolen funds? Michael, I'm calling to let you know that your colleague, Carlos Hernandez, was arrested by the FBI 2 weeks ago, and he's told them everything about your operation. There was complete silence on the other end of the line. Michael, are you there? I want you to know that the FBI has been recording all of our phone calls for the past month. They know about the call center you work at. They know about your supervisors, and they know about the other elderly people you've been targeting. I could hear panicked voices in the background, and then Michael hung up on me. Within minutes, the FBI's monitoring equipment was picking up frantic phone calls from the number I had just called. The scammers were calling their supervisors were calling their bosses, and Agent Bradley's team was tracing every single call.
Mrs. Carpenter, it's working perfectly, Agent Bradley said, monitoring the activity on his computer. They're in full panic mode, and they're leading us right to the top of their organization. Over the next 6 hours, the FBI traced calls from my local scammer network to operations in Florida, Texas, California, and even to overseas call centers in Mumbai and Kingston. Each traced call provided evidence of a criminal conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything they had originally imagined. But the best part came that evening. Mrs. Carpenter, Detective Walsh called to tell me, "We've made 18 arrests today across 4 states. The raids on the call centers recovered over $2 million in stolen money and victim lists with over 50,000 names on them. 18 arrests, 50,000 potential victims protected, $2 million recovered. I had started this journey as a victim who lost $8,000 to a fake grandson scam. Now I was part of the biggest elder fraud takedown in FBI history." But Agent Bradley had even better news when he came to debrief me the next day. "Mrs. Carpenter, I want you to know that your courage and cooperation have probably prevented millions of dollars in losses to elderly Americans. But there's something else I want to discuss with you." "What's that?" "The FBI wants to offer you a position as a consultant on elder fraud cases. We want you to help us train other seniors to recognize and report scams. We want you to work with us to develop better protection strategies for elderly Americans." I looked around my living room where, just weeks ago, I felt like a helpless victim, confused and embarrassed by how I'd been manipulated. Now the FBI was asking me to help lead a national effort to protect other seniors from the same criminals who had targeted me? Agent Bradley, when do I start? But the scammers' problems were just beginning. Because once word got out about what the 73-year-old grandmother had accomplished, other elderly Americans started fighting back too. And that's when the criminals realized they had made their biggest mistake. They had turned their victims into an army.
The story of my undercover work with the FBI spread faster than I ever could have imagined. It started with a local news interview that Detective Walsh had suggested, but within 48 hours, my phone was ringing with interview requests from national news networks, magazines, and even talk shows. "Grandma Goes Undercover to Catch Phone Scammers" became a headline that captured people's attention across the country. But more importantly, it inspired other elderly Americans who had been victimized to come forward and share their own stories. My first television interview was with Channel 6 News in Columbus. The reporter, Jennifer Martinez, had done extensive research on elder fraud and asked thoughtful questions about both my experience as a victim and my work with law enforcement. "Mrs. Carpenter, what would you say to other seniors who might be embarrassed about falling for these scams?" I would tell them that being targeted by these criminals doesn't make you stupid or gullible. These are professional fraudsters who use sophisticated psychological techniques developed specifically to manipulate elderly people. The shame belongs to them, not to their victims. The interview segment ended with my phone number for a new hotline Agent Bradley and I had established for seniors who wanted to report suspected scams or get advice about suspicious calls. Within hours of the broadcast, the hotline was flooded with calls. Elderly people from across Ohio were calling to report scam attempts, ask for advice, and thank me for speaking out about an issue many of them had been too embarrassed to discuss. But the call that meant the most to me came from Emma, my college-age granddaughter. "Grandma Helen, I just saw your interview online. I can't believe you went undercover with the FBI. You're like a real-life superhero." "Oh, Emma, I'm hardly a superhero. I just got tired of being treated like an easy target." "Grandma, you don't understand. My friends are all sharing your story on social media. You've become famous for fighting back against people who prey on elderly people. Do you know how cool that is?" The social media attention Emma mentioned was something I hadn't expected. Carol helped me understand that my story was being shared on Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms by people of all ages who were inspired by the idea of a 73-year-old woman taking down an international criminal network. But the real impact became clear when I started receiving letters from elderly people across the country. One letter particularly moved me. "Dear Mrs. Carpenter, I'm 78 years old, and last month I lost $15,000 to scammers who convinced me my grandson was in jail. I was too ashamed to tell anyone, including my family. After seeing your story, I found the courage to report what happened to me.
The FBI agent I spoke to told me they're investigating the same network you helped expose. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to be ashamed of being a victim and that I can still fight back. Sincerely, Margaret Stevens, Portland, Oregon. Letters like Margaret's convinced me that Agent Bradley was right about going public with my story. My experience as a victim and my work with law enforcement was helping other people find the courage to come forward and report crimes that might otherwise go unpunished. The national media attention led to even bigger opportunities. I was invited to appear on Good Morning America to discuss elder fraud prevention. I testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for stronger protections for elderly Americans. I even spoke at the annual conference of the American Association of Retired Persons, or AARP, where I received a standing ovation from 3,000 seniors. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the launch of what became known as the Helen Carpenter Protocol, a training program that taught elderly Americans how to recognize, report, and even help investigate scams targeting their age group. Working with Agent Bradley and Detective Walsh, I developed a curriculum that combined my teaching experience with law enforcement expertise. We created workshops that could be presented at senior centers, retirement communities, and churches across the country. Within 6 months, the Helen Carpenter Protocol was being used by law enforcement agencies in 37 states. I was traveling almost constantly, presenting workshops and training sessions to groups of seniors who were eager to protect themselves and their communities from scammers. But the most rewarding part of my new role was the direct impact I could see on individual lives. During a workshop in Phoenix, an 81-year-old man named Robert told me that my presentation had helped him recognize and report a romance scam that had already cost him $5,000, but could have cost him much more. In Denver, a 75-year-old woman named Patricia said that learning about my FBI collaboration had inspired her to work with local police to catch a contractor who was overcharging elderly homeowners for unnecessary repairs. In Miami, I met a group of retirees who had formed their own scam-fighting club after attending one of my workshops. They were actively investigating suspicious businesses in their community and working with authorities to protect other seniors. 6 months after my first scam call, I had gone from being an isolated, vulnerable widow to a national advocate with a platform to protect thousands of elderly Americans from the criminals who targeted them. But the ultimate validation of my work came from an unexpected source. Agent Bradley called to tell me that Carlos Hernandez, the scammer I had helped to catch, wanted to meet with me. Mrs. Carpenter, Carlos is facing 20 years in federal prison, but he's been cooperating fully with our investigation. He says he wants to apologize to you personally and help with your fraud prevention education efforts. The idea of meeting face-to-face with the man who had tried to steal thousands of dollars from me was both intriguing and intimidating, but I realized it could be an opportunity to understand the criminal mindset in a way that might help me protect other potential victims. Agent Bradley, I'd like to meet with Carlos, but I want our conversation to be recorded so we can use it to help other seniors understand how these scams really work. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at the Federal Detention Center where Carlos was being held. But what I learned from that conversation would change how I thought about scammers, victims, and the complex psychology of elder fraud.
The Federal Detention Center was not a place I ever imagined visiting, but as I walked through the security checkpoints with Agent Bradley, I felt a sense of purpose that had sustained me through 8 months of fighting scammer networks across the country. Carlos Hernandez looked different than he had the day he was arrested in my living room. Gone was the confident, well-dressed businessman who had tried to steal my money. The man sitting across from me in the gray detention center uniform looked tired, defeated, and genuinely remorseful. "Mrs. Carpenter, I want to apologize for what I tried to do to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." I studied his face, using the same instincts that had helped me evaluate students for almost 5 decades. "Carlos, I appreciate your apology, but what I'm more interested in is understanding why you chose to target elderly people like me." Over the next hour, Carlos told me a story that was both predictable and heartbreaking. He had started working for the scammer network because he needed money to support his family. He had been trained to view elderly victims not as people, but as marks, sources of income that existed to be exploited. Mrs. Carpenter, they taught us that old people were easy targets because you were lonely, confused about technology, and too proud to admit when you'd been fooled. We had scripts for everything: how to sound official, how to create urgency, how to make you feel stupid if you asked too many questions. But what Carlos told me next was the most valuable insight of our conversation. The thing is, Mrs. Carpenter, most of us doing the calling didn't understand how much damage we were doing. We just saw numbers on a screen, how much money we could get from each call. We never thought about the real people behind those numbers, people like you who had worked their whole lives to save that money. I leaned forward. Carlos, if you could say something to other people who might be tempted to get involved in scamming elderly people, what would it be? I would tell them that the money isn't worth it and that the victims aren't just numbers. Mrs. Carpenter, when I saw you in that courtroom testifying about how our scams made you feel afraid and stupid, that's when I realized what we had really been doing. We weren't just stealing money. We were stealing people's sense of safety and dignity. Agent Bradley recorded every word of our conversation, and we later used Carlos's testimony in educational materials that showed both sides of the elder fraud problem, the techniques used by criminals, and the human impact on their victims. But Carlos had one more surprise for me. Mrs. Carpenter, I want you to know that your story has become famous among people who work in scammer networks. You're known as the grandmother who fought back and brought down a whole organization. Some scammers are actually afraid to target older women now because they don't know if they might be another Helen Carpenter. Walking out of that detention center, I realized that my journey from victim to advocate had accomplished something I never could have imagined. I had become a deterrent to the very criminals who had once seen me as an easy target. Over the following year, the impact of my work with the FBI and my national education campaign became clear through statistics that Agent Bradley shared with me regularly. The Helen Carpenter Protocol was now being used by law enforcement agencies in all 50 states. Over 100,000 seniors had attended workshops based on my curriculum. Most importantly, reports of elder fraud to law enforcement had increased by 400% in states where the program was active. Not because more seniors were being victimized, but because more seniors were confident enough to report crimes and seek help. The FBI estimated that my work had prevented over $50 million in losses to elderly Americans in the first year alone. But the personal victory that meant the most to me came on a spring morning, exactly 1 year after I had received that first fake phone call from Tyler. I was in my kitchen having coffee and reading the newspaper when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, and I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety that any senior who has been targeted by scammers knows well. Hello? Is this Helen Carpenter? Yes, this is Helen. Who is this? Mrs. Carpenter, this is Margaret Stevens from Portland, Oregon. I wrote you a letter several months ago about losing money to scammers who pretended my grandson was in jail. I immediately remembered Margaret's letter, which had been one of many that inspired me to continue my advocacy work. Of course, Margaret. How are you doing? Mrs. Carpenter, I'm calling to tell you that your story changed my life. After I reported my scam to the FBI, they asked me to help with an investigation similar to the one you worked on. Last week, we caught the people who scammed me, and they also arrested 12 other criminals who were targeting seniors across Oregon and Washington. Margaret had become another Helen Carpenter, working with law enforcement to take down the criminals who had victimized her. But that's not the best part, Margaret continued. My granddaughter, who's in college studying criminal justice, says I inspired her to specialize in elder abuse cases. She wants to become an FBI agent like Agent Bradley because of what we accomplished. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in my kitchen looking around at the awards, newspaper clippings, and photos from speaking engagements that now decorated my walls. But what I saw most clearly was the framed photo of Frank that still sat on my kitchen table. Frank had always worried about me taking risks, but I think he would have been proud of what I accomplished.
I had transformed from a victim to a protector, from someone who was targeted for my vulnerability to someone who was feared by criminals for my strength. My phone rang again, another unknown number. A year ago, that would have filled me with dread. Today, I answered it with confidence. Hello, this is Helen Carpenter. Mrs. Carpenter, congratulations. You've won $1 million in our senior citizen sweepstakes. To claim your prize, all you need to do is... I listened for about 30 seconds, then interrupted the scammer. Sir, this is Helen Carpenter. I'm the grandmother who worked with the FBI to take down that international scammer network last year. Would you like to hang up now, or would you prefer that I trace this call and have you arrested, like the last group of criminals who tried to scam me? The line went dead immediately. I sat back in my chair and smiled. At 74 years old, I had become every scammer's worst nightmare, an elderly woman who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be fooled, and had the FBI on speed dial. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just fighting back. It's becoming so good at fighting back that your enemies are afraid to target anyone who might be like you.